Thank you, Peter. That was both a lovely and a terrible introduction, because there's no way that I'm going to live up to that, especially since I know that we're all slightly punch drunk after an entire weekend of thoughtful and heavy deliberations. But thank you very much for your kindness. I do appreciate it. And thank you for all the hard work that you have put into organizing this conference. You and your volunteers, but you especially, I think we all recognize that this is both an exercise in passion and reason for you, but even more than that, an enormous amount of labor. So thank you very much for doing this for all of us. And thank you to Her Honor for rejoining us. As Peter said, your presence here lends the weight of both you personally as well as the weight of your office to our deliberations. So thank you. Comme c'est un congrès canadien, je devrais vraiment dire quelques mots en français. Alors, voici quelques mots en français. Mon discours sera en anglais, mais si vous avez des questions à la fin, veuillez certainement les poser soit en anglais, soit en français. So I've chosen the subject of the clash between passion and reason. Perhaps we could take down the lights a bit. Thank you. And I know that on the face of it, may seem something of an esoteric subject, but I think it strikes at the very heart of the challenges we've been talking about this entire weekend, and the challenges confronting both Democrats and democracies. I'll be candid, this is actually a very difficult subject for me. I try to be a thoughtful person, and I see myself as a rational person. But the truth is that for all of us as humans, we are all creatures of passion before we are creatures of reason. Now, sometimes we derive our emotional responses to politics and to public policies from logical arguments. But I think more often, we seek out arguments that justify how we feel. And while that has always been the case, I think human nature has not evolved a great deal in the short time we've been on the planet. I do think we have arrived at a moment in history where emotion has utterly triumphed over and displaced facts in political discourse, to the great undoing of many societies. I'm going to, somewhat ironically, rationally and with a fact-based argument, try to make the case for why I think this has happened and how democracies can and should respond to this reality. So the title of this conference is, of course, Constitutional Democracies Under Stress. And in some ways, it is astonishing that we are having this conversation in 2019. The 20th century began as the age of the dictator, and it ended with the triumph of liberal democracy as the ascendant political philosophy across the world. Today, absolutely every political leader, almost every political leader, claims to be a Democrat. And that is especially true for political leaders who don't have a democratic bone in their bodies, and who instead want to co-opt the language and institutions of democracy to deliver to them the power and the personal advantage that they, in another age, would have seized at the barrel of a gun. And as a result, everywhere in the world, democracies in the 21st century are in crisis. And this is not just true in new democracies, for example, the ones that emerged from the fall of the Soviet Union, where growing pains of those societies mean that they continue to struggle with issues of corruption, and where they have legitimate grounds to say that democracy has not lived up to the perhaps overvolted billing that had been given while they were living under tyranny. The crisis of democracy is happening even in mature democracies, where there has been a calamitous decline in public confidence in democratic institutions, and I think, as this graph shows rather astonishingly to me, a decline in public confidence in democracy itself, the necessity of democracy, and even the public good of democracy. Now, I will confess my bias. Much of my own life has been entwined with democratic development and trying to make a contribution to Canada's democracy. As Peter mentioned, I served in partisan politics. I later worked in international democratic development. I now work in international peace and conflict resolution, which is intimately tied up with creating durable and resilient democratic institutions. And I believe passionately that public service is the highest secular calling, that it is the best response to the yearning all of us feel to be part of something greater than ourselves and to live our lives in pursuit of ideals more noble than the mere satisfaction of animal appetites. And so this crisis of democracy is in many ways a crisis for me personally, because I am astonished to discover that not everyone shares that view. And recently, I've been thinking back to an incident that happened 14 years ago when I was in Jordan, my holiday snap, working with the United Nations University on strengthening the Parliament of Jordan. Jordan is ruled by a king. It does have a legislature. The legislature is relatively weak by our standards, relatively strong by the standards of its region. And after the talks were completed, I visited Petra. If anyone ever has a chance to visit Petra, I urge you to do so. It is a beautiful, hauntingly beautiful place. And I met Nazar, the young woman pictured in this photograph, although both of us have aged somewhat since then. She spoke 7 languages and asked me, naturally, what I was doing in her country. And I explained to her the work that I was doing with their parliament and the work that I was doing trying to help legislators, both in Jordan and in the region, strengthen their legislatures, the mechanics of their legislatures and the role of their legislatures in being able to hold the executive branch to account. She listened quite patiently, and at the end of it, she said 2 things to me. The first was, "You are all kinds of crazy," and if I ever have a biography, that will be the title of it. The second, though, was delivered to me through my translator, and I cannot say whether he gave me a word-for-word translation of what she then said or was capturing the essence of it, but what he relayed to me was that she said, "Do you think it's possible that you are fetishizing democracy?" And that phrase has remained with me ever since that. 14 years, I still remember that conversation, because I had no response to her at that moment, and I'm not sure that I have a response for her today, because from her perspective, she did not care what kind of system of government Jordan had. She had no intention of ever becoming a legislator, given her circumstances, no realistic prospect of ever doing that, and no real interest in the political process. What she was interested is in the question of, irrespective of the kind of system of government that we have, will that system allow her family to have a minimum standard of living? Will it discourage public corruption that impoverishes her and her community? Will it reduce her exposure to violence? And will it acknowledge her dignity as a person? The idea of democracy did not have a purchase on Nazar's emotions and on her heart as it does on mine, because she instinctively understood something which perhaps I did not, and that is that a democratically elected president or prime minister can be just as tyrannical, just as incompetent, and just as contemptuous of his or her populations as any king or autocrat. I think that if I could bring her here today, she would say to me, she would say to all of us, "Don't tell me that democracy is a beautiful theory. Prove to me that democracy will deliver the goods for me and my family." And I would say that in many ways, the crisis that we find ourselves in democracies is that too many people have come to believe that democracy is in fact not delivering the goods. Now, I will offer you what I think is the promise of democracy very briefly. We've discussed it. I don't think I have to go into great detail about this, but it's, I think, useful for the rest of this. The first is that democracy is the best way of delivering legitimate government. It ensures that whether the government is good or bad, it is a government in which we are masters of our own fate. It is government by us and for us. It's something that it ensures that government is something that we do together. It's not something that is done to us. And it upholds the idea that we are all equal in dignity before one another and equal citizens before the law. One man, one woman, one vote encapsulates, not just in a phrase, but in an action, the fundamental ideal that there are, in fact, no one amongst us who is born to rule and no one amongst us who is born to serve, that we all stand equal before the law and, at least in principle, equal before one another. It's also the system that I would say has the greatest promise of justice. Democracy, by its nature, is based on the rule of law, and, more importantly, it places the people as the ultimate check on public power. It means that the people are in a position to restrain the executive, if only by voting a government out of office periodically. And it ensures that by having that emergency brake on the political system, that the people have the greatest protection for our freedoms. Not all democracies are free societies, but I should argue that every free society is a democracy. It's also the system that holds out the promise of being the one most likely to produce governments that pursue policies that are in our interest, because self-interested political actors will promise and hopefully pursue policies that appeal to the population, and it produces governments that have an incentive to be competent as well. The democratic system, this theorem that I've put up is the Condorcet theorem. I don't get too excited about it, but it is the 18th century formula that first posited the idea that the more people and the more jurors there are, the more likely that we are to have a good decision. The more electors there are, the more voters there are, the more likely a society is to elect a good government. And I think Tom quoted or referred to his friend Pericles. There was a phrase that Pericles used, and I don't remember in which book it was, I think it was quoted by Thucydides, that although only a few may originate a policy, we are all able to judge it. And that is the key to democracy. Even if all we do, voting is not the same thing as democracy, but even if voting is the only thing that we do, it makes governments better and more accountable. But all the things that I've discussed, legitimacy, justice, and effective government, that the promise of democracy are based on one critical assumption, and that is that we as citizens are the best judges of our own best interests. Not someone sitting in the Manor House, not someone sitting in the Politburo, but we ourselves are the best judges of what constitutes a good life and the best judges of how to achieve that. And I believe that to be the case. Whenever I hear people talking about the need to bring in more censorship, to restrain hate, or the need to bring in forms of social regulation, I always think that if you are a true Democrat at heart, either you trust your fellow citizens or you don't. And if you don't, then whatever you are not a Democrat. But having said all this, that system, the case for democracy falls apart if we are in fact not the best judges of our own best interest. It falls apart when reason falls to reckless emotion and facts perish and the entire system is put into peril. And that is why this is the subject I've chosen to speak about. Because when facts give way to emotion, the entire edifice of democracy falls away. Prejudice then supplants logic, and democratic societies and democratic institutions lose any ability to make rational and informed decisions. And democracy breaks its promise to the people. So I'm going to look very closely at very quickly at some of the factors that have driven public concern about some of the perverse outcomes of democracies. The first is that we have undoubtedly seen across the world in the 21st century, instead of legitimate governments, the rise of demagogues. That is, the rise of political leaders who are elected not because they offer rational arguments or not because they offer a different vision of the public good, but because they are able to appeal to our darkest emotions. They appeal to our primordial fears and to our thoughtless bigotries. They offer us no real solutions, but they do give us someone to blame. And, having achieved power, they seek to delegitimize all the institutions that can hold them in check and the institutions that can and should protect us from them. We've also seen the rise of authoritarianism, that is, political leaders and governments who are elected precisely because they promise to strip our societies and our institutions of the very checks and balances that are a cornerstone of democracy. They promise to strip us of our rights, and we elect them. And the reason we elect them is that they convince us that the laws and norms that are our protection against them are barriers to them being able to rain down terror on the people that they have taught us to despise. While this is an unacceptable argument in any society, and it's a poisonous argument in any society, and it's also slightly mad, because I cannot understand how anyone can be stampeded to the ballot box with that argument and not realize at the back of his or her mind that having dealt with the people whom we've been taught to hate, those leaders will in short order turn those weapons upon them. Nevertheless, it has been an effective argument. And perhaps the bitterest irony is that democracies across the world have elected governments, and people are electing governments even though they themselves are the most apt to be harmed by the policies of those governments. We see a majority of people in Wales voting for Brexit, despite the fact that Wales is largely dependent on subsidies from the European Union, and Welsh farmers are entirely dependent upon exports to the European Union. We see a majority of white women in the United States voting for Donald Trump after he has been caught boasting about sexually assaulting people just like them. And we see a majority of Brazilians voting for Bolsonaro, even as he promises to make it possible to burn down more of the Amazon. There is one example that I think encapsulates all of this for me, and what has caused the run in public confidence in democratic institutions, and that is the British referendum on Brexit, on exiting the European Union. On your left is the famous Brexit bus that during the campaign drove around London, indeed drove around the United Kingdom, making the fatuous claim that Britain spends £350 million a week on the European Union. Vote for Brexit, that money will come back and go into the health system. It was perhaps the most famous campaigning device of that referendum. It was a complete lie. But for everyone who says he or she was convinced by that bus, there is a difficult fact to grapple with, and that is that bus was so famous and so controversial that every newspaper, including newspapers like The Sun that were pro-Brexit, carried articles demonstrating the bus is a lie. Everyone who saw that bus also heard the message, the bus is a lie. And if people voted based on what they read on the side of a bus, it wasn't because they were inveigled or deceived. It's because they heard lies and they heard the truth, and they decided that they preferred easy lies to hard truths. They preferred comforting fantasies over discomforting realities, and they preferred blazing emotion over cold reason. And so with all this before us, I think it's easy to make the case that we are in an age where the political process is awash, not just with emotion, but with dark and destructive emotions. Now, we are all a balance of emotion and reason. And the question, I think, is why has the pendulum swung so far away from reason and towards emotion? And I'm going to offer 4 ideas for why this is. The first is the difficulty we all have now in assessing facts, in deciding what is true and what is not. I don't know if you can see it, but that stained glass, I've placed the photograph there, is a stained glass of commemorating the Royal Society, the National Science Academy of the United Kingdom. Its motto is famously nullis in verbis, which I think basically means there's nothing in words, but it usually is translated to mean take no one's word for it. And in many ways, that is the motto of the European Renaissance, the idea that we should take no one's word for the truth. We should believe the evidence of our senses, and we should use our senses to test the evidence. That has been the hallmark, I would say, of not just of Western thought, but of global thought ever since then. But we have now arrived at a point in history where the world is so complicated that reasoning things out by ourselves, testing the evidence ourselves, is not an option for most of us. The question of, it's very easy for me to say, and I'm going to say, vaccines do not cause autism, and I don't think there's anyone here who believes that. But fundamentally, is any one of us, unless you are a scientist or a medical doctor, can you actually test that evidence? Or do we have to rely upon the evidence provided and the analysis provided by experts? And it's very much the latter. The world has simply become too complex, too specialized, and the decisions that we're being called upon to make draw upon such deep and complex science and science, then our ability to weigh the evidence has fallen away. And instead, we have to decide which experts do we choose? Who, of those people who have the capacity to analyze the facts and who have the capacity to test the evidence, which one are we going to say, you are a competent test of the evidence, you, by contrast, are not? And that is not an easy process. That is not an easy process to follow. And when people cannot rationally assess the facts, often when we try to assess the facts, or indeed when we try to assess whom do we trust, we tend to go with our emotions. Do I feel this person is trustworthy? Is this person, and critically, is this person giving me a narrative, irrespective of his or her qualifications, that appeal to the things I already think? The second is that traditional centers of knowledge and traditional centers of reason, though I would say have served us well, in the minds of many citizens, they have failed us, because I think there's been poor public education on the scientific method. So, for example, I said vaccines do not cause autism. I think every doctor, every real doctor would agree with that. But I know that there are people who say vaccines cause autism who would say to me, the same doctor who's telling me don't worry about vaccines were the same doctors, the same medical establishment who told us, don't worry about opioids, they're not addictive. And finally, we've talked a lot about the rise of social media, and I do think that there's a bit of an inflection point there. In the past, if something made it into a newspaper or on television or on the radio, it more or less had to go over, because of the cost of those broadcast media, those stories had to go over certain hurdles and certain hoops. That doesn't mean that television, radio, and newspapers didn't mislead us, didn't get things wrong in the past. They most certainly did. But because the barriers to posting information are so much lower, effectively zero on social media, the likelihood or the ease with which lies propagate, appealing lies propagate on social media is commensurately higher. And I think especially for people like myself who did not grow up with the internet, too often we transfer the kind of confidence that we had in newspapers to new media such as Facebook, to the ruination of us all. The other is, the fact that traditional authorities have squandered public confidence. And that is, when Donald Trump, for example, and I'm going to try not to bring up Donald Trump too much, but it is difficult in a subject like this not to go back to the archetype of emotion over reason. But when he says that, during the campaign, when he said that the United States was governed by a corrupt, self-serving elite, he was not wrong. He was absolutely correct. Now, he didn't mention that he was going to be a far more corrupt, far more self-serving member of the elite, but we'll put that one aside. He was elected in part because, for many reasons, but one of the reasons was that he was able to tap in to the very real and the very justified sense that traditional democratic institutions and the kind of people who inhabit those institutions have adopted policies that have not served the interests of large sections of our population. In Canada, this graph refers to global numbers, but in Canada, the vast majority of economic growth of the past generation has accrued to a minuscule percentage of our population. And over the last generation, there has not been a single province in Canada where inequality has not grown. Right now, 2/3 of the fabled 1%, richest 1% of Canadians, work or worked for the same corporations as their fathers. And poverty is becoming largely racialized in our own country. Non-white families are 4 times as likely to live in poverty as white families. In effect, we are at risk of becoming a kind of semi-feudal society with inherited wealth, inherited power, and inherited servitude, where the course of your life will be determined not by your intelligence, your ability, your industry, but by the circumstances of your birth. And that is not what democracies were supposed to be about. People rightly feel despair and they rightly feel rage. And unfortunately, cold reason cannot survive those hot emotions. In some ways, I think that the flight from reason is our version, our generation's version of the French Revolution's reign of terror. During the French Revolution, the people certainly were oppressed, and they were right to be angry. But that anger drove them to take steps that were destructive, not just for the ruling class, but profoundly destructive for themselves, and in the end, brought in governments that were even more authoritarian than the ones that they had removed. I think that the flight from reason is following a very similar path for us. There's the issue of social polarization. We're in the midst of a federal campaign in Canada, so I think I don't think many people in this room will disagree with me when I say that that campaign has not been edifying for any of us. In effect, the arguments being made, at least by larger political actors, is not our party is great, it's that the other party is evil. And if you vote for them, you're evil too. There's been a loss of civic space, an opportunity in our society for people who have different views to come together to not just speak out one another, but to listen to one another and find an opportunity to build common ground. And finally, I would say that social media, once again, is playing a role in driving social polarization in our society. People feel prepared to behave towards one another in social media in a way that they would never behave towards one another if they were standing face to face. And what's more, the algorithms in many social media platforms, well, they never provide you in your newsfeed with posts in chronological order. They privilege engagement. That means they privilege posts. They serve up to you posts that are most likely to get you to stay on that platform, posts that are most likely to excite you. And nothing excites people more than anger and rage. Social media is therefore feeding each of us who is on a social media platform a steady diet of posts by our fellow citizens that make us angry, and make us angry at one another. And while that's perhaps a profitable way to run a social media platform, it's no way to run a society. And finally, I would say that there are many, as Canadians, we flatter ourselves to say that we live in a cohesive society, and I think that is largely true. But I think that we overlook the number of our fellow citizens, the number of us who live without dignity. I have to say, the worst part, and speaking of someone who grew up in modest circumstances, the worst part of poverty is not simply that it deprives you of material necessities, it is that it strips you of your dignity. And throughout this conference, while it is full of people who, and uniformly full of people who mean well, and the only reason to be here on this weekend is because we want to make our country a better place and we want to make the world a better place. There is a pattern that I have noticed at every other such gathering, and that is that when speakers speak of the poor and the working class, those speakers tend to use the pronouns they and them. And when speakers speak of people who have the solutions to the ills of society, those speakers tend to use the pronouns we and us. And although that is a small thing, it is in the small things that we betray ourselves. Though I grew up as a child, I grew up in Parkdale. I grew up as what was then called a crown ward, a ward of the courts. My life now is not like that. But when I hear that still puts my teeth on edge. And if that touches me in that way, you can imagine how it touches people who are still living in those circumstances and how it fills them with rage at the people who may be presenting them with policies that serve their best interest, but whose language appears to drip with at best condescension and at worst contempt. The great talent of demagogues and of authoritarians across the world is that they have learned to speak language that valorizes the poor, the worth of, and the heroism of the poor and the working class. You are real people. You are the backbone of the country. It is, for people who live without dignity, that language is incredibly seductive, especially when it comes from the most powerful person in the land. It is so seductive, in fact, that it can cause you not to notice that that person is pursuing policies that are grinding you into the soil. So, now that I've thoroughly depressed everyone, I'm going to offer up, very quickly, some thoughts on what it is we can do about this. So how to respond? The first, I think, is the importance of public education. And I was very pleased to hear Doug in the previous session talk about the role of public educations and of high school. If there is one thing that we could do as a society, it is to ensure that the free public education system is the system of first choice and not the system of last resort. Yeah. So as I mentioned, I grew up in Parkdale. This is my high school, Humberside, which is near Hyde Park. And going to that school changed my life. It was because I was at Humberside that I won a scholarship to Oxford, and the course of my life has changed beyond recognition compared to that of my peers. But I do want to sound a note of caution about the importance of public schools, which are the drivers not just of public education and of knowledge of the tools of being a member of society, but most importantly of all, cultivate the skills of critical thinking, our ability to be self-aware, our ability to step outside of our skins and think critically about our emotions and the kinds of people who are appealing to our emotions. That, I think, is one of the key missions of public education. And I think in Canada we have been very good at it. But we have not been perfect at it. Humberside is not in Hyde Park. It was a wonderful school. It looks glorious. The hallways are filled with art that has been commissioned by generations of its students. In the Great Hall, there is a mural by Arthur Lismer, a member of the Group of Seven. As far as I'm aware, the only monumental mural painted by a Group of Seven artists that hangs within touch of all the students of that school. But the only reason I went to Humberside was because I was in French immersion, and that was the closest school that had a French immersion program. If I had not been in French immersion, I would not have been allowed to attend Humberside. I would have been compelled, under the Board of Education's rules, to attend Parkdale Collegiate. And I will simply say that there are no Group of Seven paintings hanging in Parkdale Collegiate. Toronto and Ontario has an astonishingly racially segregated public school system. And I have noticed this in the work that I'm doing in Mosaic, which has programs that take us into high schools to cultivate the next generation of leaders in pluralism. And that racial segregation is not explicit, but it is implicit in postal code discrimination. Unless you have to go to school in the public school in your neighborhood. And that means if you are a poor child, you go to a school in a poor neighborhood that is filled with poor children. And that should not matter in a public school system, but that does matter in a public school system. Because if you take all the poor children, put them into one school, and all the middle class and rich children, put them in another school, I can tell you the expectations in those two schools will not be the same. And even if the facilities offered to those students in the two schools are, which often they are not, to be poor is to live under a tyranny of low expectations. And the ability, when I said to my guidance counselor at Humberside that I wanted to go to Oxford, his only question was, do you have the forms? If I had said that to a guidance counselor at Parkdale, I'm not sure that would have been the response. And finally, I would say that in the public school system, we are, without question, seeing a decline in real funding for our schools. That is a short-term savings. It is a terrible long-term investment in our society, because the kind of society where the best education belongs only to those who can pay for it is the worst kind of society. I'd also... As important as public education in the formal public school system is, that is not the only form. I would also say that public institutions have a responsibility to cultivate a culture of democracy. And I'm not just saying this because she's here, but the Lieutenant Governor's initiative on the value of democracy is exemplary. It is, as Peter mentioned earlier, it is extraordinary that it is an unelected officer of the Crown who is perhaps the highest profile proponent of democracy in our province. but there we go. But I think that all public institutions have to understand they cannot take public confidence in public institutions for granted. And cultivating a public understanding of what those institutions do, what their role is in society, and how individual citizens can become actively involved in those institutions, in nurturing them, collaborating with them, and in holding them to account is vital to develop a culture of democracy, a democratic reflex, and public confidence in public institutions. I won't go into a long discussion of what policies would actually restore meritocracy in our society, but I would say that meritocracy is in peril in Canada. And there are many policies that can and should be at least debated, but I think are not part of common discourse. That chart that I put up shows how progressive taxation is across those states. I think it should astonish, and probably does astonish many Canadians to know that our income tax system is significantly less progressive than that of the United States. We often think of ourselves, and you cannot have a progressive nation and you cannot have a progressive democracy if you do not have progressive taxation. And I would say a cornerstone, perhaps not of democracy, but of liberal democracy, is that to be a true meritocracy, it's not simply a case that each of us is free to reap as he or she sows. It is also, on the reverse, that those who benefit the most from the meritocracy should proportionately bear the greatest responsibility for maintaining the system that has made their success possible. On depolarization, I'm going to give a bit of a plug for Mosaic's work. That is to say, what the basic business of Mosaic is bringing together people from opposite sides of international conflict to help them discover common ground, build a sense of common identity, and resolve the conflicts that divide them. And that kind of work, I think, is vital not just across the world, but it's vital in every society. It means having spaces, both physical and virtual, where people who are different from one another can have conversations, demystify one another, discover one another's common humanity, and hew to the ideal, to the reality, that each of us has far more to learn from one another than we have to teach. It also means an opportunity, and some of the work that Mosaic does is simply bringing people together to have a chance to speak to each other. There are other areas where creating opportunities for different people to be part of shared decision-making, because pluralism is not just a passive quality. It has to be built, it has to be nurtured, and it is the result of action. I've done work in the former Yugoslavia. Anyone with a connection to the republics that have emanated from Yugoslavia knows that the Yugoslav civil wars were the bloodiest civil wars on European soil since the Second World War. In that work, many of those legislators hate each other. Most of them had been shooting at one another at some point, and some of them had taken out contract killings on one another's families. Yet, we were able to bring them together to sit down at a common table to discuss how they could work together to combat political corruption in their countries. Because these countries all had inherited common kinds of institutions from the former Yugoslavia, they all understood instinctively that they shared a common challenge and had common solutions to corruption. And that act of making decisions together is desperately important. The third way, I'd say, of nurturing depolarization are by shared projects. Some of Mosaic's work in national reconciliation after the Sri Lankan Civil War involved bringing together Canadian Tamils, Canadian Sinhalese, and Muslim Canadians from Sri Lanka. Those three groups were never going to agree on the rights and the wrongs of the Civil War. But being a pluralistic society doesn't mean that we have to agree. It means that we have to live with one another in equal dignity. And so the work that we did with them was we got them to collaborate with one another on a project to dig wells in Sri Lanka to ensure that communities who had been devastated by the war had access to potable water. They never agreed, and they never will agree on the rights and the wrongs of the Civil War, but they do agree that they are all human beings And as Canadians, as human beings, we don't leave people to die of thirst in the desert. And that experience of working together on a project that emphasizes their shared humanity is one of the elements of building a pluralistic society. And lastly, I would say that there were elements of shared creations. That is, we brought together some survivors of genocides, or the descendants of survivors of genocides, to create art projects and to create video projects where they were able to tell the stories of their families. And that too was an example of people often on opposite sides of conflicts, or people who disagreed with one another, being able to collaborate on shared creative exercises. All this is simply to say that building a pluralistic society is not just, it's not like the weather. It's not something that we inherit, and it's not something that exists. It's an act of will. And we as Canadians, if we wish to have a sane society, and if we wish to have a society that preserves everything that we've come to believe is important about a society, it has to be through shared action. I'm almost done. And finally, I would say that there is a critical role in ensuring that the work that all of us do in this room, as individuals, as members of organizations, as participants in government, that when we try to make our country a better place, that we begin with an emphasis on the dignity of the people we are trying to serve, and we do so with empathy rather than from a posture of charity and philanthropy. It's easy to look at some of the situations, for example, in the United States, my last Donald Trump reference, I promise you, in the Rust Belt, who have voted for Trump and waved their signs at his rallies, even though his policies are making every one of them poorer. It's easy to look at them and think there is something wrong with those people, that they are making that choice. There is nothing wrong with the people who are making that choice. The problem isn't with the people who have turned their back on democracies. The problem is with the people who are running those democracies and who have made it seem like a rational choice for those people to vote for someone who is metaphorically cutting their throats. That is a failure in those institutions, and as I said earlier, that is not a good and healthy choice that they have made. But in some ways, though it is an emotional choice, it is a rational choice, because they are choosing dignity over their long-term economic and social interest. They're choosing the dignity that comes from someone who, though he flies in, flies out, and I strongly suspect in his heart of a heart holds them in contempt. Nevertheless, when he flies in, he speaks to them as if they were equals. And that's something that many of those individuals will have heard for the first time from someone in a position of power, even though he doesn't mean it, even though it's insincere, even though it's a cover for him exploiting them. That is how important human dignity is to someone who does not have dignity. In the end, I would say that all of the measures that I've talked about share one thing in common, and that is it's an opportunity for us to join hands as citizens to share in the authorship of the social contract that binds us together and defines us as citizens. The flight from reason is, to a certain extent, a flight from democracy, and that is because people feel that there is no place for them in democratic institutions, and we have to change that. I would end by saying that although I have talked about the opposition of emotion and reason, or at least the ability of emotion to blind us to reason, I do not think that emotion is a bad thing. It is part of human nature, and the course towards strengthening democracy isn't about suppressing emotion. It isn't about putting it aside. It isn't about telling people that they are wrong to feel what they feel. It is a fool's errand to try to change human nature and to deprive people of their emotions. It's a fool's errand to say to people that you do not have a right to your rage. The question is, how are we, as people who have a long-term commitment to democracy, how are we going to reclaim emotion? And how are we going to ensure that when people think of democratic institutions, they think of it with enthusiasm rather than with dread? Doug put up the allegory of good and bad government from Siena. I've never studied art, so I'm probably going to get all of this wrong, because this is just things that I remember from reading. But as I recall, the Council of Nine commissioned that painting because they wanted to strike awe in the hearts of the magistrates who were in the business of government. They wanted to remind them of the importance of the act of government and of the consequences of bad government. And they wanted to strike awe in the hearts of the citizens of the Republic of Siena. Siena was rare in that point in history as a republic. And the Council of Nine understood something that I think we often forget today, and that is, to have the loyalty of citizens, you must have the emotions of citizens. That painting was about inspiring citizens to believe that through their active citizenship, they could make their city a better place, and through failing to be active citizens, their city was literally going to go to hell. At the start, I said that the promise of democracy and the case for democracy is that it delivers legitimacy, justice, and effectiveness. But when I look into myself, I think that's true. But when I look into myself, those aren't the reasons why I am so personally invested in democracy as an idea. The reason I'm invested in democracy is that it speaks to some of my deepest emotions and some of my deepest convictions and hopes. I believe that democracy is the means for each of us to become better individuals and better human beings, because it means that we must build better societies where we join hands with one another as free and equal citizens and enjoy a share of one another's strengths and shoulder a share of one another's burdens. I'm moved by democracy because I think it's a means to achieve the oldest dream of human civilization, and that is to create societies where the laws that bind the weak and the powerless no less bind the great and the powerful. And I think democracy is a means to preserve and to celebrate the fundamental human dignity that is the birthright of every human being. Democracy relies on human reason to function, but it needs human passion to survive. And for all of us in this room, we have to reclaim democracy, not just for our minds, but also for our hearts. Thank you.